Good evening and welcome to the CCCW seminar today. And we hope some more might come and join.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. I was here just maybe 2 years ago, I think it was, and I gave a paper which was published last year in a longer form than the paper, as the book Chinese Public Theology. Most of my research to date has really focused on Christian thought in China by Chinese Christians, roughly in the 20th and 21st century. But more recently, I've gained an interest in the development of Christianity amongst Chinese in Britain. And this is today's sort of talk is a bit of an overview, if you will, and is more of a preliminary aspect of my research on the subject. So it's a bit of an overview of the history of the development of British Chinese Christianity and why I think it's a distinctive form of Chinese Christianity that's worthwhile to study. Excuse me. In particular, if you look at the scholarship that exists on overseas Chinese, as is often termed, or diasporic Chinese, excuse me, you'll notice that the majority of the literature is on the U.S. Okay, it's about American immigration of Chinese to America and the development of Chinese Christianity within the U.S. context. Okay, now this is, of course, makes sense because you have a very large population of Chinese that moved to the U.S. I'm an American-born Chinese myself, so I am a product of the immigration patterns and so forth in the U.S. But it also highlights particular idiosyncrasies related to immigration patterns and immigration policies. And almost always, if you look at literature on Chinese American Christianity, every book will have a chapter. And in that chapter, giving the background, it'll always talk about two major immigration policies. One is a Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay, so after the gold rush, Chinese were seen as a nuisance. So they were excluded. They were not allowed into the country. So from 1882 until the middle of the 20th century, Chinese laborers could not come into the country. They were denied entry. The second is what's known as the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. And this act in particular abolished any type of quota system or limitations, and it opened up the possibility for immigrants to come to the U.S. that were highly skilled, highly trained individuals. Okay, so one of the consequences of this, of course, the first act was an act of legalized racism, if you will. The second act was a positive legalization of racism, if you will. Okay, so one is a negative, one is a positive one. In the sense that the first one prevented immigration of Chinese, the second one preferenced a particular type of immigrant. Okay, in particular, those who are highly educated, highly skilled professionals. So in the discourse on Chinese American Christianity, much of this revolves around the concept of, the term is model minority, that Chinese Americans are model minorities. They're better than the other minority, the problem minority. They're the model minority. They're good students. They're well educated. They're engineers and lawyers and so forth, and doctors. So this is the perception that you have within the Chinese American context. Now, within the British context, and this is why I think it's very important to look at the British context, the British context is actually quite different compared to the American context. Just very briefly, if we think about the earliest immigration to Britain, we have to think about seamen. okay? And these are all men, okay, that from the Napoleonic Wars all the way until World War II were recruited to work the boats, okay? They did the logistics work, okay? They were the hard laborers that made sure the boats ran for all these wars and stuff that the British Empire was involved in. Initially, part of this included trade with China as well as Malaya, and the need continued to arise to draw Chinese seamen to be involved in both military affairs as well as merchant fleets. And this is why, if you look at the UK, as you know, on a map, the main places where Chinese were living, were settling, were in the port cities, in particular London, Liverpool, Glasgow, Cardiff. These are the major port cities that you had Chinese that were establishing themselves. Those who stayed on tended to run laundromats. That was the main trade that they picked up. And of course, the men would find wives, which were often local Brits, if you will, as opposed to any Chinese, because you don't have Chinese sea women, I guess would be the term. In any case, but so you have this very, and they're coming from all parts of China. Okay, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Hainan, Shanghai. So all various parts of China. But what we have happening during this time is most of these seamen, most of these contract laborers, they were illiterate. Coolie is the term, coolie workers, so the hard laborers, and very few would have known about Christianity. The first sort of major Chinese that we know as a Christian that lived for any long time in the UK was this figure, Wang Feng, who was he came to the University of Edinburgh, of all places, to study medicine, and he came through the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Society. So he was sponsored by the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Society and studied medicine. And in 1855, he returned to Canton, and he worked with the LMS, London Missionary Society, to distribute medicine and practice medicine in China. But during this period, you also have, in the late 1800s, this growing interest within China of what we call the self-strengthening movement, this desire to modernize China and industrialize. So what you have in the late 19th century into the early 20th century is you have Chinese students coming to the UK. And here's sort of an outline of the different places that they came from and what they studied. You can see some studying education and economics and politics, medicine. Very very practical skills, right, for the betterment, the modernization of China. You can see kind of the regions that they're going to, London and Edinburgh being the two major destinations. But the reality was that the students that were here represent about 1/10 of the size of all the Chinese, of the population of Chinese that were in the UK. So about 450 students out of about 5,000 Chinese. So the vast majority were seamen, right, or former seamen. Very few of these would have been introduced to Christianity at this time. Some were introduced to Christianity through the mission colleges in China and brought over, but very few of these individuals would have been Christians. But what in particular changed was the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, the British government created the British Nationality Act of 1948. And what this did was it created a new status known as the citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies. Okay? And what this meant was those who were from colonies such as Hong Kong and Malaya would be understood as British subjects. and they could enter the UK, freely. And so during this time, there was beginning to have a rush of immigration from Hong Kong into the UK. And this would continue to develop in terms of immigration. It was not only, immigration policy changed a bit to be more restrictive, and I'm not going to go into details just now, but it became much more restrictive. What happened was there ended up, not only from Hong Kong did you have Chinese coming to the UK, but you also had this influx of Chinese from mainland China going into the New Territories region of Hong Kong, coming south after the Communist Revolution started in 49. And so you have this influx of mainland Chinese into Hong Kong, the New Territories region of Hong Kong, which puts a strain on the economy here. Okay, this is mainly farmland. Puts a major strain on the economy here, and it pushes many Hong Kong residents to the UK. Okay, so that's one factor. But then there was a loophole in the policy, in the immigration policy, that allowed those who were born outside of Hong Kong to be able to enter via Hong Kong into the UK. So there was this, just an odd loophole that they didn't realize for like a decade, or a little longer than a decade, that allowed this extra immigration. So you have this influx going into Hong Kong and then out of Hong Kong, as well as from within Hong Kong going out, right? The other major dynamic during this time was happening in Vietnam, and so many refugees coming from Vietnam, in particular Chinese refugees coming from Vietnam would come as well. But what this started to do was it introduced a large percentage of Chinese coming into the UK from Hong Kong and the Hong Kong region, as well as from Malaya, later known as Malaysia and Singapore. But it also, it was dominated by Cantonese speakers, okay? But it also introduced individuals coming from what we call Hakka or Hokkien languages. Okay, so these are two other language groups. And they are mainly flooding in from mainland China into Hong Kong. Okay, so coming through that route or through Malaya in particular. And so you have this variety of languages and cultures. Okay. Now, why did they want to come to the UK? Okay, this promised land of sorts, right? Well, why did they want to come to the UK? There was a major draw in the UK at the time, and that was Chinese food. Now, this is an interesting invention, because when I came to the UK, I was like, what is this? This is very interesting, Chinese food, It's not like the Chinese food that I've had, in other parts of the world. There's I say that in jest, but, there's some truth in that, right? And what was happening was in the post-war period, you have the British population having more liberty in their funds. They started having a little spare change, and so they wanted to go out and eat. Okay, so that's one factor. But another factor was that many Brits had been traveling during the war period for diplomacy, for war, sometimes for trade. But they were introduced to different types of food, right? And there was a growing interest in different international world foods, however you want to term it, and in particular Chinese food was quite a draw. And so all these immigrants would come in from China, from Hong Kong, from Malaya in particular, and they would all come and do catering work. Okay, by 1985. This is an astounding statistic. By 1985, okay, you have about 200,000 Chinese. Okay, 90% are working in the catering business. Okay, running takeaways or Chinese restaurants and all this sort. Right. So you have quite an interesting demographic, and it's a very different demographic that's sort of concentrated from sort of the Cantonese kind of regions. So it's more focused in terms of the group that's coming over. But the vast majority are coming over to run the restaurants. There's also individuals coming over, particularly from Singapore, Malaysia, that are coming to study and to stay on as students, as well as Hong Kong. But the vast majority are are going into the restaurant business. Now, like the earlier population, the majority of these ethnic Chinese were coming in, but were not exposed to Christianity. Many of them did not know about Christianity prior to coming, with one exception. And that exception is a group known as the True Jesus Church. This is a very interesting group, and it's if you know much about if you've read anything about sort of history of Chinese Christianity, the True Jesus Church is sort of an indigenous movement that started in China and in Shanghai, and it's a oneness Pentecostal Sabbatarian sectarian group. Okay, which means it's oneness, non-Trinitarian, Sabbatarian, Pentecostal, self-explanatory, Sabbatarian, Saturday worship, and sectarian. They worship the true Jesus, unlike everybody else. Okay, so this is a group that that was started in Shanghai, but in particular there was an enclave after communism took over China. There was an enclave within the New Territories region, a little island. The literal translation is Duck Island, like quack quack, duck. Duck Island, and on this island it was all True Jesus Church members. And so when one came over, they would sponsor another one. And through chain migration, basically, Duck Island today has very few people living on there. It's like maybe a handful of people that are still there. They're all in the UK. And largely in the north of England, so from Newcastle north. So these are two of them in Edinburgh that I took pictures of. And they're of course in the restaurant business as well. So this is perhaps one of the exceptions to this idea that most were not introduced to Christianity. Now, how then do have Chinese come to know Christianity and become Christians since then? In particular, one of the most important persons is this man over here, Stephen Wang. And he's a very interesting man. He was once a headmaster of a Methodist school just outside Beijing. And then he actually came to England, to Cambridge, to study. And he was also a William Peyton lecturer in Balliol colleges in Birmingham. In the late 40s. And when he came over for a couple of years, he was planning to go back, of course, to his family. But this was 48, 49, communism takes over China. He cannot return to China. And he never sees his family ever again. He dies in the UK, separated from his daughter and his wife.
What's his name again?
Stephen Wang, W-A-N-G.
Stephen Wang,
yeah. He's a man who was a headmaster of a Methodist school, as I said, in Beijing, and he was trained at Yenjing University. So, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's a more modernist liberal school in Beijing during the time. But after his studies, he was involved in the student volunteer movement, and he was introduced to a man named Wang Mingdao. Who, if you're familiar with that name, that's a very well-known fundamentalist preacher. They self-describe as a fundamentalist. Wang Mingdao introduces him to a different expression of Christianity, and he sort of develops an evangelical faith, if you will. But then later on, when he's in the UK, he's a Methodist, and he goes to a Methodist meeting in Liverpool, where the Methodist Church was discussing China and what was happening in China at the time. And while he was in Liverpool, he would walk the streets and he'd encounter all these Chinese, right? Because this is Liverpool, right? This is where all the seamen were